hopefully it will be fun. Yeah, as she said, I teach here at BTC. I'm in the Information Technology Department. And yeah, let's get into this. Now, first thing I need to go over is I have a few disclaimers because I do work here and I do help put on the fest. First disclaimer should be I'm super tired right now. I've been working on this fest for the last like 2 weeks straight, and everything seems to have come together pretty well. I'm very happy about that, but I might be a little loopy for this one, so strap in.
It's the home stretch.
So the other things I need to say are the views here are mine alone. They don't reflect BTC or LinuxFest. This is me talking about how I feel about operating systems and what I like about them. If I say something like Ubuntu sucks, which I'm not saying, it could be construed and that it could have angry letters please send them to me and not my place of business. They're just opinions. Yeah, feel free to talk to me at the end or ask questions when we get to the Q&A time. But if I say something that you disagree with, don't just start shouting out over the top of me. And then this one, I've had to add, all questions must be questions. I understand everyone's here because they really are excited about Linux, but every so often somebody will raise their hand and just start talking about the thing that they're super excited about for 10 minutes. And while it's great for them, it doesn't make for great recording. So if we can all agree to follow these things, then everything should be good. All right. So what is Linux? It's an operating system. It is a free open source operating system, kind of like Windows is an operating system, or Mac is an operating system, or Android, or iOS, or anything that you really use to interface with a computer. So what we call Linux actually refers to the Linux kernel. The kernel is not like kernels of corn, but instead it's actually a translation layer. And this is where we're going to get into our first thing that you need to understand about Linux. Nothing is what it says it is. If you hear the word kernel, it's not actually a kernel. If you hear the word rainbow tables, there are no rainbows. But the kernel is an interface layer. It allows more user-focused processes like applications to communicate with the actual built-in hardware of the system. It does the translation. It's what allows computers to talk back and forth. Strictly speaking, Linux is not the Linux kernel is not a huge part of the Linux operating system, but it's where it gets its name from. And yeah, it's pretty cool. We also need to talk about GNU briefly. GNU is not this lovely creature, although that is also a GNU. I'm going to be talking about GNU/Linux, which for this slide I'm going to refer to it as GNU/Linux, and this slide alone. So with GNU/Linux, there's the idea that GNU is a larger part of the operating system. When Linus Torvalds was first working on this as a college project to teach him to code, he started messing around with this thing called GNU, which was a way of getting away from Unix and having a free, open operating system. And he built his kernel to use GNU. Strictly speaking, GNU is way more of the operating system than the Linux kernel is. So when Linux took off and got super popular, some people decided that it needed to be renamed to GNU/Linux because that is more reflective of what is going on with the actual operating system. Personally, I think a thing is whatever is easy to call it, but that's just me. I think that this is kind of clunky, but I'm not here to editorialize on that. But GNU, we will get into as a philosophy and all that a little bit later in the slide deck. So these are some people that are going to come up a lot when you first start getting into the Linux area, and they're things you need to know. The first one's probably the most important. This is Tux. Tux is the reason why you're seeing all sorts of penguin stuff everywhere, including like right there. Tux is the mascot of Linux. He is an adorable penguin. The reason why Linux mascot is a penguin is because Linus Torvalds once said, hey, we should have a mascot, and I like penguins. And then this happened. But yeah, if you've ever wondered why the penguin is associated with it, I think it was 1996. They decided to create a logo mascot for it, and Tux the Penguin was born. Here's another person that we should talk about, Linus Torvalds. I've already mentioned his name a whole heck of a lot here. And he is a Finnish software developer who now lives in Portland. And he is super great. If you ever read all of his postings online, it's a little blue, so don't, maybe age restrict it a little bit. He can go on some pretty crazy rants, but he is the creator of the Linux kernel. And he didn't like create the Linux kernel as something big and fancy and like, here's the operating system that's going to have like 2,000 people showing up to a small town in Washington to hang out and talk about it. He was working on it as a college project. It was to help him learn how to code. And one day he posted it to the internet being like, hey, I know this isn't as cool as all the stuff you guys are working on, but if somebody could take a look at this and like maybe give me some feedback, I'm working on this new operating system thing. I think it could be really cool. And from that moment on in 1991, Linux was born, and it's kind of just grown like wildfire since. The last person that we need to talk about is Richard Stallman. Richard Stallman is a bona fide genius. He is the creator of the GNU project. He is one of the biggest advocates for freedom on the internet. We'll get into what I mean by freedom in just a second. But he also is what some would call a hardliner. He is very, very, very much in favor of freedom. Some would say to an extreme. But he created the GCC, which is the C compiler that without it, none of the stuff that we have today at LinuxFest would really be possible. He did a lot of the programming for the early portions of GNU. He is the reason why this fest is happening, and he is the big proponent of the name change to GNU/LinuxFest. Oh, 1 second. I probably should have talked about this on the GNU slide, but GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix, which is our first example of a recursive acronym that we're going to run into today, meaning that the acronym is inside of the acronym. And this leads me to another thing that I need to talk about for Linux and open software in general. As a community, we are terrible at naming things. You will see this a lot. There will be things that just don't make sense, like recursive acronyms, and you gotta understand about that. A very nerdy person thought it was a funny joke, and that funny joke became a piece of software, and that piece of software probably became something that Fortune 500 companies use every day. All right, so let's talk about freedom. It's not freedom as in free beer, although there is free beer at LinuxFest, but it's more freedom as in this. The idea that if you want to make something yourself, you should be free to do so. And the biggest thing that has made the internet as free as it is because of the GPL, the General Public License. I think we're on version 3 currently. It might be 3 point something. I don't follow it too closely. But the GPL, the basic idea behind it, and I'm really boiling this down a lot, don't take my word as gospel on it, but the basic idea behind it is if you release something under the GPL, anyone's free to take it, look at it, use it, create their own thing, change what you've done. There's only really one major rule, which is you have to then re-release the information out to everyone else as well. Anything that touches GPL becomes GPL. So if you're going to be using a GPL product, then you also have to be free with it. You can't just take it and privatize it and close source it and then, turn it into something that you're going to make oodles of money off of, because that wouldn't be good for the internet. The internet and computing as we know it really thrives off of this free exchange of information and ideas. So I probably should have changed this slide a second ago, but yeah, that's why you should care. The freedom The openness, all of that stuff is super important to the Linux community. So what is Linux good for? Why do people use it? Besides the freedom, besides all these ideas, besides all these philosophies, what's the point of this thing? Well, it's really, really good at being a server. And I don't mean like this. It's more like this. In fact, Linux is the best at being a server. It's super stable. I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for that one. But specifically the BSD guys, I think, are going to be a little miffed at me for saying that. But I'm going to stand by it. It's the best at being a server. Linux is, since there's so many eyes looking at it all the time, there's people checking to make sure that stays free of nasty backdoors and awful bad things getting into your code. It allows you to spin up websites. It's more stable than Microsoft because it's not hauling around this big, herking graphical user interface on top of it. It can run command line. It can run with prettiness. It can do all sorts of things, and you can customize it to be exactly what you want it to be. And it's so popular as a server that as of 2014 is 79% of all servers are running Linux. Now that's the high end of the estimate. I'm going to be honest here. I think it was 64 to 79 was when I was looking it up. But that's huge, and it's to the point where it's beating Windows. And it's beating Windows so bad that even in Microsoft Azure, their infrastructure as a service, it's 40% of Microsoft Azure now is all running Linux. And that's because it is so good at delivering content quickly and efficiently and being stable. Like, Microsoft now recommends that you run Microsoft SQL Server, which is their database program, on Linux. What's up?
Didn't Microsoft release a Linux version last
Yep.
week or something?
Yeah, actually that's the third one that they've released. The first one was a Switch-based operating system in 2015. But yeah, they just released their own operating system, and you can now get a full-on Linux command line in Windows. What's up?
What's the new operating system called?
I have no idea. Good question, though.
SpearOS?
Probably. Let's go with that. SpearOS? I'm going to go on the record and say probably SpearOS. All right. So, how do I Linux? Well, y'all are probably familiar with how you Windows. This is the one flavor of Windows that you're going to get if you want the latest version of Windows. I mean, technically, you could run Windows 95, but that's really not a good idea. But for most people, if you see Windows, this is what you get. You might also be a Mac person, and if you run Mac, I mean, the desktop changes, but this, for the most part, is what you get. With Linux, you got a few options, and this is the super condensed list. This is the origin point of the Linux operating system. For those of you that are listening and can't see what I'm doing, I'm pointing at the penguin on this graph. And everything coming off of this point are different Linux distributions that fork and change off of each other. Now, when a distro forks, it's because somebody is like, oh man, that's a really cool thing that you're doing, but I would do this different thing with it. And then they can, because they can take the code and they can change it and they can re-release it, and we see that a lot. That's why there's so many branching paths here. And some of the times when somebody's like, hey, I think I could do this differently, and it would be really great, and I'm going to make my own thing, the people that made the original thing see it and are like, oh, yeah, that is really great. We're going to take that back and put it back into our operating system and make ours even better. That's one of the reasons why there are so many different types of Linux, which if you're interested in learning about those, stick around for my 102 talk, which is coming up right after this. But yeah, you can really try just about anything. There's a couple of main distributions that everything kind of forked off of originally. There's like Slackware and Debian and Red Hat and a couple of others. But for the most part now, everything's just kind of spreading out, enjoying itself, changing, using stuff from other distributions, and everything's just getting better together. Also, you can make your your Linux look like Windows if you feel like, or Mac. This is actually on the laptop that I'm currently running. These were taken about a week ago. I customized it. You can reskin it. You can change how it looks, feels, acts, interacts. It's the same operating system, the same desktop manager even. These are all running GNOME, which that's probably the one of 2 times that I'm going to call it GNOME instead of GNOME. But yeah, you can really make it look however you want. So Windows, Mac, or Linux. So let's get into a little bit of jargon, because there are going to be terms that are thrown around, and this is where we get into things that aren't what they sound like. So the first thing we're going to talk about is bash. So bash is not what it sounds like. It's not hitting someone. It is the command line. Operating system might be a strong word, but it's the command line interface that most Linux distributions use. And bash is really, really, really nice and useful once you learn how to use it. But at first glance, it's kind of terrifying, which is why it's really nice that a lot of modern Linux distros, you don't really have to go in and touch the command lines. The days of having to mess around with your command line interface to get your wireless working for like 4 hours are dead and gone. Pretty much all wireless works out of the box now. But bash is this command line interpreter. And when you open up the command line on Linux, most often you're going to get bash. Also, when you open up the command line on macOS, you're going to get bash as well. So if you already are a Mac person, you can start messing around with the command line interface at very least just by opening up a terminal in there. Let's also talk about root. So roots, not as in plants, but okay, so this slide is slightly deceptive. There's actually 3 different things called root in the Linux operating system because, once again, as a group, us nerds are really bad at naming things. So the root that we're going to be talking about right now is the super user root. It is the administrative account on the system. And a lot of you might have an administrative account on your Windows system. Most of you at home, if you're just running a home edition of Windows, you have an administrative account. That's your default account that you log into. But it does not have the powers that root does. There's actually a hidden account in the Windows operating system called System.
There is?
Yep. It's called System, and it's the root equivalent in Windows. System is what is used to spawn all of the desktop environments. It's what is used to do all the background, back-end stuff inside the Windows operating system. In Linux, all of that is handled by the root user. And the really, really cool thing about Linux is you have access to the root user right out of the box. Has anyone here ever heard the term rooting your phone? So for those of you that raised your hands, I'm guessing you probably know, but rooting your phone is the act of gaining root access, or the ability to use the administrative account on your phone, meaning that you can do anything that you want to the phone's operating system. Now, the other 2 roots in the Linux operating system, I don't have slides for it, but I'm just going to go over them real quick. There's root that is just a /, and that is the start of the Linux file system tree. All points in the file system of Linux spawn off of root. If you're not interested in command line, you can just totally zone me out. Catch like 10 seconds of sleep right now. And then there's also the root user's home account, which is off of root, and it's the word root, but if you're in any of my lectures going forward, I will always try to make them as distinct as possible, either saying root user, root of the file system, or root user's home account. So I just always give that lecture for my students as well. Now, the cool thing about root is that you can do pretty much anything to the operating system with it. The scary thing about root is you can also pretty much do anything to your operating system with it, up to and including deleting the entire operating system while it's up and running. You can delete your entire operating system with a single line in the terminal. So in order to prevent people from having to always run with this absurd amount of power, they have created a command called sudo. Sudo stands for super user do, which is why I have to just sudo it. It's kind of like Nike. But yeah, sudo is a command that allows you to run one other command with root privileges. So if you run sudo something, it runs that whatever that thing that you just ran as the super user, allowing you to run one-off things as super user without having to risk breaking the rest of your account. And then let's talk about one of the areas that I think Linux is just hands down better than any other operating system at. If nothing I've said yet has convinced you to check it out, let's talk about how you download programs in Windows versus how you download programs in Linux. Because in Windows, has anyone ever seen a page like this with all the fake download buttons? You're going out to get stuff. Yeah, it really, really sucks. I have at least one student a year that accidentally clicks on one of these while we're going through labs and gets some type of nasty thing on their computer and has to re-image. Linux doesn't go that route. You don't go out to the open internet to get your files, to get everything. Instead, you have a package manager, which this isn't actually the package manager. This is the app store that Ubuntu created, which is one of the first app stores ever in existence. If you've ever used an app store on your phone, or an app store in Windows now has it, or Mac, you have Linux to thank for that, because the original idea came from Linux and their package manager. And what it is it's a repository of all the packages that you could possibly want to install on your Linux operating system. Give or take a few, and you can always add them in later. And with it, instead of having to go out to some seedy website or click on a link randomly online, you can just go through and choose any program that your operating system can run, click a button, and it's installed. Or if you're running it from command line, one line, and you have it. And the really, really cool thing about this is, if you ever need to get updates for that file or that program or that whatever else you're running, you run one more command on your operating system and it updates everything. Not just the operating system, but all of your files and applications as well. This is one of the reasons why Linux is said to be way more secure than Windows or Mac. Well, Mac has its own problems with security, mostly security through obscurity, but that's another talk for another year. All right. Now, oh, what's up?
I just want to mention that it's the package manager that we're using, whatever package manager you're using under Linux, can be thought of as a trusted third party.
That's not a question.
Oh, sorry.
Is GitHub included in the package manager?
Yep. Well, GitHub isn't Git is. So Git the program is, GitHub is a website. You can install GitLab and run your own version of GitHub locally, but everything about Git is open source except for the website GitHub. That's private and a company and its own thing.
Oh, okay.
But GitLab, I really recommend checking it out if you want to host your own Git repository. It's my personal favorite. So this is a list of programs that you might think that you need, and that's the reason why you need to stick with Mac or Windows. I only got a couple of these, but they're the ones that come up most often. But I need to edit images, and the most common one to come up here is Photoshop. Everyone is like, hey, I need Photoshop, I need it for my editing, for my art job. And my suggestion to replace this isn't a one-to-one conversion. I'm not going to say that this other program is just as good as Photoshop or just as easy to use as Photoshop, but it's close. This is GIMP. This is GNU image something something. I really should have done more research on what GIMP stands for. But what?
GNU Image Manipulation Program.
GNU Image Manipulation Program. Thank you. I knew somebody would correct me, so thank you for allowing me to be lazy once again. So with GIMP, you can do pretty much everything Photoshop can do. Now, it might take you like 20 more clicks to get it done. and you might have to relearn everything that you knew about Photoshop, but it runs and it's free, and you can get it on Windows, Linux, Mac. And it's completely free, and you can look at the source code, and if you're an uber nerd and you don't like the way it works or looks, you can modify that source code and try and get it remerged back in and contribute to the project.
You can get it on your phone too.
You can get it on your phone too. I just learned that. That's awesome. Although, once again, we need to get into the fact that Linux people and nerds in general are bad at naming things. The other thing that I should also point out is that Photoshop now has a cloud-based version that you can use just with the web browser, so there's really no excuse for Photoshop anymore. And then the other one that I hear a lot is an Office suite. A lot of people don't like the fact that you can't get Word running natively in Linux. Well, to them, I recommend there's two really nice open source products. There's OpenOffice and LibreOffice. First, there was OpenOffice, and everything was great, and it was a great free editing standard, and it used an open document format, .odf, for its files, and it was super cool. And then it was sold to Oracle, and one of the things that you're going to learn if you hang out in this community at all is that everyone seems to have a really big grudge against Oracle. So when it was sold to Oracle, or when Oracle bought it, they forked it. The community was like, cool, you can have that, but we're going to stop working on it. We're going to work on our own thing. We're going to call it LibreOffice, and we're totally going to beat you. And they did. And LibreOffice was king for the longest time. And then Oracle was like, what are we doing with this weird Office program? And then they gave it to Apache. And now they're both pretty good. And they're both fairly open. They're slightly different. I recommend trying them out both of them and seeing which one you like better. But yeah, they're both really cool. Also, you can use Office 365 in the cloud, so there's no excuse anymore, and Google Docs, which is what I'm running this presentation out of. I mean, they're not as free, they're not as open, but if you really need the features, like there's some things that LibreOffice version of Excel just can't do, and that's not any failing of theirs, it's just it takes a lot of time and effort to create these programs, and most of these people are working free unpaid. So if you ever need something that's very specific, you can get it through there. All right, and then there's always Wine. And that's not just for dealing with the fact that you're running Linux as an operating system. It is for, it's a program. It stands for Wine is not an emulator. It is a conversion layer, and this is our second recursive acronym of the day. It references itself inside of the name. But Wine is, as its name says, not an emulator, but functions similarly to create this interface layer that pretends to be Windows on the back end, so you can run Windows programs natively inside of Linux. Not everything works. A lot of stuff does. There are websites out there dedicated to letting you know what programs work well in Wine, so before you make the jump over, be sure to check that out if you have something that you absolutely need to have. But I really recommend giving Linux a shot. So where do you go from here? So typically I tried to give this talk first thing on Saturday in the past. That didn't happen this year because I ended up being way more involved with getting this fest to run. And this is like the first time I've been able to break away from running stuff all fest. So I'm going to say where you go from here is probably sticking around in this room if you're still interested in learning about more distros, because I'm going to keep talking about that. But also when you get out of here, maybe during the half-hour break between the two lectures, you just go out and you start talking to people in the expo hall. They're all going to be super helpful, friendly, want to get to know you, want to tell you why their stuff is super cool. It's really a great fest. This is community supported, community driven. Everyone's here because they want to be here and they're excited about being here. So go strike up a conversation. You could end up talking to the creator of Excel. I know for a fact that he's on campus at least yesterday. or you could end up talking to the guy that created one of these programs that we were talking about here. Or you could just find some guy that's really into Linux, and that's awesome. So I really just recommend going out, starting to be part of the community, starting to ask questions, and we'll get that ball rolling with questions here. I'm going to try something new just for this presentation since we are live streaming. I just found out that I can ask questions online as well, so if anyone is watching online and wants to ask a question, it should show up on my laptop, but anyone in the room have questions?
With regards to Libre and Apache Office, the base program requires Java, and there were some problems with that. Do you know if they're resolving or going to find something else to replace Java?
I believe that they are working on it, but I am not entirely sure. I don't follow those packages super closely. Any other questions?
Yeah. So a lot of enterprises are going from Unix to Linux now. Is there some key differences besides the open source aspect?
Yes. So Unix tends to be one of the reasons that drove people away from Unix originally is the licensing and the fact that it is privately owned, and a lot of people want to sell you Unix instead of having it be freely available. That and the fact that while Unix operating systems might have a few key devs working on them, maybe even a lot of key devs working on them, they'll never match the scale of the Linux community. It's huge now, and a lot of times if you have a problem with a package, like some new updates break something, give it like 3 days and somebody has taken time out of their day to fix that because it was annoying them as well, and they saw it and they're like, no, this shouldn't be this way, and they fix it and they get it approved and it gets merged upstream, and then it's on your operating system. So just the flexibility, the more eyes on it, and also the security have really drove a lot of people from Unix to Linux. Does that answer your question? Cool.
How's the scalability of Linux compared to, say, Unix?
Linux tends to be, at least in my experience, tends to be more scalable. Unix, once again, this is all personal experience based, tends to be a little bit less flexible, a little bit more rigid. Linux really tends to be more adaptive, fluid, and it's growing faster and adapting to this new cloud-based environment that we find ourselves in way, way, way better.
Are there any resources for, say, a small business, no more than, say, 50 people, that for migration, information about migration, or
That is a great
education about, in other
question.
words, change management? How do you
Yeah.
just address change management?
That is a fantastic question that I've never been asked before. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm going to get your email address after this. I'm going to look into that, and I will have an answer for you. Because that, yes. Typically, it's you get a sysadmin in who really likes Linux, and then they'll drive the bus on it. But if you want to move yourselves over, I'm sure there's resources out there. There gotta be. It's someone's pet project is maintaining a site that talks all about migration strategies from Windows to Linux.
What about malware and viruses? How is that in the Linux environment?
Oh, so that's great because we use the package managers, and all of the code that we get has been reviewed and checked, and it's all open, and there's nothing hidden in it. Linux is one of the most secure operating systems as far as viruses that you can get. You do have to do a couple of common sense things with it. You can't go adding repositories from untrusted sources because that can sometimes lead to you getting packages from bad people. But for the most part, if you just use the Linux operating system and stick to the package manager, there is almost no way to get a virus in desktop Linux. Now, I'm sure now that I've said that, somebody's going to correct me online, but hey, that's why we do these talks.
There's also ClamAV.
Oh yeah, ClamAV.
Norton,
Yep.
McAfee, they all run on Linux as well if you want to do that, especially if you're running a server where Windows
yeah.
systems interact with it and you're getting untested data back.
For servers, yeah, it's a completely different ballgame. Servers, you definitely have to be a bit more on the ball security-wise, but Linux for home desktop use, I don't even run an antivirus on mine. That's how confident I am in what's going on. In the back.
I don't know this question, but I'm going to ask it for the benefit of others.
Okay.
Gaming on Linux.
Oh yeah, it's gotten way better. This is one of the things I'm super excited about. So it's not perfect yet. There are specifically first-person shooters don't seem to have gotten on board with Linux yet, but for just about everything else, Steam, specifically their CEO Gabe Newell, has been really pushing the idea of Linux as the new platform for gaming. It's one of his pet projects and his babies, and the Steam machines, or the Steam OS, actually is Linux. It's Linux based. So he's, through this massive company that he has that's responsible for so many game sales, he's kind of forcing the industry to adapt and start porting things to Linux. And the other big thing that's been happening is Kickstarter. Kickstarter has been working fantastically for getting games on Linux because it's typically a stretch goal on popular games to make it go multi-platform. And if they're going to do Mac, they might as well do Linux. It works really great, and even if your game is not cross-platform, there's always Wine, or there's Crossover Linux, which is I think that's what it's called. It's a program that allows you to, it's kind of like Wine, but it's more focused on gaming, getting everything right. But yeah, this is quickly becoming a golden age for Linux gaming, to the point where I'm running this as my primary gaming machine now, and I'm running Fedora 27, and I'm able to use my graphical processor just for video games, and everything else switches over to using my Intel-based processor, so I have better battery life on my laptop. It's really getting cool with how Linux and gaming is working. Any other questions?
So how does Wine work? Is you load that as a separate program?
So you install Wine, and then when you try to execute an exe, Wine takes over the exe extension and creates just enough of a Windows-type operating system underneath to be able to launch and execute the games. And that just translates the information live between the Windows application that's running and the Linux operating system hardware.
It remaps the libraries.
Yeah, it remaps the libraries, it handles all the translation, but to you, as a user, as long as you have Wine installed, you can just install your EXEs like normal, and everything just works, assuming that it's a thing that has Wine support.
Does that make it in any way less secure?
It depends. Typically, Wine is only active while that program is running, so if the program itself is doing nasty things in the background, you can become susceptible to those things, but only inside of that program as far as I know. I'm pretty sure Wine is fairly rigorously sandboxed is what it's called, so it's not able to interact with the rest of the operating system, just the information going through.
Is there some site that would outline which major programs would run under Wine? For example,
Oh yeah,
say Photoshop or PaintShop Pro.
Does anyone here know the name of the big one?
Tricks is
Wine
another
itself.
good one.
Yeah,
Wine
Wi-
HQ.
Yeah, Wine HQ, Wine Tricks. There's a couple of them, but if you just Google runs on Wine or DuckDuckGo or Bing or whatever, I know I get people every year talk to me about how I say the word Google too much. So I'm trying to be better about it.
If you search for.
Yes, if you search for it, but Google is just such a good verb.
Yes, I know.
But yeah, if you search, does this run on Wine or program Wine? Top result is going to be somebody explaining how well it works and if there's any known flaws. And if there are known flaws, here's how you work around them for the most part. It's a really great and cool community.
So like, if I want to run Excel,
Mm-hmm.
full version of Excel, do I install that?
So I'm not
on
sure
my
if
Linux.
I'm not sure if Excel's full desktop version works with Wine? Does anyone know?
It has. I haven't used it in a long time.
Okay. So
Play on Linux is a good option.
Okay.
You install Play on Linux, you open it up, and then you go and you search for the application you want to install, and it'll install the proper version of Wine that's going to work best for that application, and then install the application as well using whatever source you provided.
And then I just want to throw out another thing that you can do in Linux that is going to be my 103 talk. I'm going to be teaching you, if you come to that one, how to virtualize your own Linux desktop in Windows. But if you do ever decide to make the jump over to Linux, you can do it backwards the other way and run a virtual machine of Windows inside your Linux operating system for those 1 or 2 tricky programs that just doesn't work.
If you're running Microsoft Office and Excel and stuff on Wine, I wanted to mention older versions of Microsoft Office will run just fine under Wine, especially like, I think it was 2007.
Okay.
Microsoft Office 2007, older versions of Microsoft Office that work just fine will run absolutely perfectly, or at least near perfectly under Wine.
That's good to know. So for those of you that are listening online, I'm guessing it's probably like one of you. That's my mom. What he just said was that the older versions of Excel and the Office Suite, specifically 2007, work really well underneath Wine, and the newer ones might not work as well. All right. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard a while back, I'm not sure how long ago, that Wine was often buggy and
Wine-
really bad. Has Wine gotten better in the past few years?
Yes. So the question was, Wine had issues before. Have they gotten any better? And the answer is a definitive yes.
Okay.
Everything involved in Linux, just in the 9 years that I've been involved in the community, has become like night and day better. The first time I ever tried to use Linux, I gave up after about a week, saying I would never use this stupid operating system again. Why would I ever touch this? Because I had no idea what I was doing, and I just wanted to play World of Warcraft, and it wasn't working. And I was beating my head against it, and then I installed the Windows 7 beta, and I'm like, cool, I'm done. I'm not going to do this. But then I came back to it when I got a job involving Linux, and honestly, I can say it is night and day different.
What kind of a penalty do you pay running a Linux virtual machine?
Oh.
What, you need to add more memory?
So the nice thing about virtual machines is most of the time you can configure how much of your system they can use, and Linux historically, and depending on what distribution you're using, can run on super small footprints. In the next talk I'm giving, I'm going to talk about a version of Linux that requires, I think, 128 megabytes of RAM and 12 megabytes of storage, and that's all you need to run it.
And
so depending on
graphics processor and such?
it does pass through to your computer. You're not going to be able to game on it if you're running in a virtual machine, but everything short of that, it should work just fine. Any other questions? All right. Well, I've been Kevin Burkeland. If you want to contact me for any reason, that's my email address. I just really, 1 second, I want to really talk about how awesome my email address is. I have no idea how I managed to get it, but my real name and my email address are the same thing, and this is like the one group of people that understands how cool that is, and I never get to talk about it, so I'm going to talk about it right now. It's awesome. I'm super psyched I got that. All right.